Just want to extend a short word of welcome before we turn the microphone really over to Tim, because it is an amazing evening to kick off our season 2. We're gonna, I don't know, I think we'll maybe work in seasons if if that works. Our season 2 of Bokprat here at Vesterheim, and it is wonderful to see so many, to see all your names on the list, and to see so many people who have been part of this virtual community at Vesterheim over these last 18 months. It's the power of this museum to curate community over these past 18 months that is just, I think, an astounding story. And it's leadership from Andrew and from Leah Lovelace and Josh Torgerson, all in the folk art school, who have paved a way for a new way for us to bring together people to talk about fascinating things pertaining to Scandinavian culture. And so I am forever grateful for them, and for their leadership in helping all of us and helping to curate the community for all of us to be together. It's an incredible honor to have Tim with us tonight. And Tim, thank you so very much for being here. This was a friend of a friend of a friend who connected us about 6 months or 5 months ago, and it is just an honor. I'm so glad we were able to realize this, because to have your view of this text, of the work, the incredible work you have put into bringing Odd Nansen's story to life in the contemporary is really, it's an incredible story. And so I'm so thankful that you're willing to be here with us tonight. And I'm excited for the conversation that we will all be able to have over about the next hour. So Tim, thank you. En stort tack, som vi säger på norsk. Tack till dig.
Well, thank you, Maren, for that introduction. And thank you, Andrew, as well, for your introduction. I want to thank the Vesterheim. I want to thank Luther College for the opportunity to speak with you all tonight. It's as much an honor for me and a thrill to be talking about a subject that I love, because, as I will probably say more than one time, this book changed my life. And so I'm a proselytizer. I want to tell people about how exciting this book is, how inspiring it is. And what I thought I'd do, I know this is billed as a conversation, and I certainly want to have a conversation. I want to be able to answer the questions that you might have, but I think it might be helpful just to kind of set the stage. So with the help of Andrew, we've put together a couple of PowerPoint slides to set the stage, give you kind of the basic facts, and then we can roll into as much conversation as you want to have. So let me begin by, beyond welcoming you, is, as I said, I want to kind of set the stage and give you the who, what, why, where, and when. So we're going to be talking about a diary that Odd Nansen kept while he was a prisoner during World War II, from the years 1942 to 1945, that he published soon after the war under the title From Day to Day. Here's an image of Odd Nansen. I'm not sure of the date of this photograph, but I think it's contemporaneous, about the time he would have been arrested in 1942. So he's a middle-aged man in this photograph. But my story, in many ways, doesn't begin with Odd Nansen. It's kind of an indirect way that I found my way to the Odd Nansen story. And it really begins with a little boy. And so, Andrew, if you'd pull up the next slide. My story actually begins with a boy named Thomas Bergenthal. And this image that you see on the left is a picture taken of Tommy in 1938. He is all of 4 years old in that photograph. Now, Tommy was born in Czechoslovakia, and he, along with his parents, were concerned. His parents had both fled Germany in 1933 to avoid the persecution that was visited upon the Jews of Germany. They met, both his mother and father met in Czechoslovakia. They married, they had Tommy, and they applied for a visa to get to England. And they were on a train actually headed across Poland to the port city of Danzig, it's now known as Gdansk, on the basis of this visa that they had received to get to England. Unfortunately for them, the date that they were on that train heading to Danzig was September 1st, 1939. And as most of you know, that was the beginning of World War II, when Germany invaded Poland. So the train never made it to Danzig. It was strafed along the way by German fighters. Everybody on the train had to bail out, and Tommy and his parents made their way to a city known as Kielce, which is located midway between Warsaw and Krakow. They had family relations there. Within a few weeks, Poland capitulated, and soon after that, the Germans started herding all of the Jewish population in Poland into ghettos. Tommy and his parents were put in the Kielce ghetto. Within a year, the Kielce ghetto was liquidated. Most of the inhabitants were sent off to Treblinka to be gassed upon arrival. Tommy and his parents were spared because Tommy's father had managerial skills that the Germans wanted to keep. They were then sent to a labor camp. That labor camp was liquidated. They were then sent to another labor camp in Poland. It looked like they were, at this point, had kind of reached the end of the road, because from there, in the summer of 1944, they were sent on to a concentration camp called Auschwitz, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. From there, Tommy was separated from his mother. She was sent to a women's camp in Auschwitz. He only saw her once for the remainder of the war through the barbed wire. He lived with his father for a while until his father was separated from him, and his father was sent to yet another concentration camp, a camp called Buchenwald. He would die of pneumonia in Buchenwald in January 1945. So Tommy, here he is. He's 10 years old at this point. He was born in 1934. He is living by himself, living by his wits in Auschwitz. And he's able to survive until January 1945, when Auschwitz is evacuated. The Russian army is getting too close to Auschwitz. So the inhabitants of Auschwitz are all marched across various routes. Tommy's column marches on these back roads for 3 days through bitterly cold temperatures, as you can imagine. Late January in Eastern Europe can be like. After 3 days of marching, he and his column are put on a train. But the train consists of cattle cars. Cattle cars have only 4 sides. They have no roof. They have no heat. They have no plumbing. They have no protection from the elements. And Tommy would spend another 10 days in that cattle car as his train made its way out of southwestern Poland, which is where Auschwitz is located, takes a long detour through Czechoslovakia, and finally turns north into Germany and comes to a stop about 25 miles north of Berlin at another concentration camp, this one called Sachsenhausen. And when Tommy arrived in Sachsenhausen, he could barely walk into the camp under his own power. He had shooting pains in both of his feet. But up until this point, on this 2-week odyssey from Auschwitz to Sachsenhausen, he dare not take off his boots to see what's wrong with his feet for probably a couple of reasons. But the most important reason was his fear that if he took off his boots, somebody would steal them from him. By January 1945, the world was really a dog-eat-dog place. People are prepared to do almost anything to stay alive. So Tommy makes it into Sachsenhausen, and he takes off his boots for the first time in 2 weeks to see what the source of this pain is. And he realizes he's got a severe case of frostbite. In fact, so severe that the flesh on his toes is already starting to rot. So he knows he has to go to the infirmary. The German word for the infirmary is the Revier. He also knows that the Revier is actually the most dangerous place you can go. The prisoners called it the waiting room for the gas chamber. But he knows he has no choice, because even if he could ignore the pain that keeps growing, he knows that if he doesn't get treatment, he's going to either get gangrene or get an infection. So he goes to the infirmary. He knows he's taking a big chance on doing this. But luckily for him, when he arrives in the infirmary, there is not a Nazi doctor on duty that day. It was a fellow prisoner. In fact, it was a Norwegian by the name of Sven Oftedal. Dr. Oftedal takes one look at Tommy's feet, sees how bad they are, and he immediately asks Tommy to get onto an operating table. A couple of adults come by, hold Tommy down. The doctor gives him some smelling salts to knock him unconscious, smelling salts, as I say, to knock him unconscious. And the next thing Tommy realizes is he's waking up in a hospital bed. He looks down to see how his feet are, and he sees they're both heavily bandaged. And the orderlies in that hospital ward explained to him that Dr. Oftedal had to amputate several of his toes in order to try to save his feet. Now, at this point, Tommy, he's alone. He doesn't know where his parents are at this point. He's been separated from them. He's Jewish. He's 10 years old, and he's just had a severe operation to amputate some of his toes, which means he's going to be laid up in the infirmary for a significant period of time. His chances of survival at that point could probably be considered to be realistically less than 1%. But luckily for him, a middle-aged man comes into that infirmary, a man named Odd Nansen. Nansen was in Sachsenhausen, and I'll talk in a few minutes about how he ended up in Sachsenhausen. But he was going into the same infirmary to visit one of his friends, one of his Norwegian friends who was sick. And he just happened to stumble upon this young boy. And for those of you who have read his diary, know that at that point, he writes in his diary, he said, "The minute I saw this young boy, my heart went out to him." But more importantly, Nansen had the one thing that could help this young child, and that is food. Food was the most important thing that you could have in a concentration camp, because most of the prisoners were starving. And if you had food, you could bribe a prisoner for literally anything you wanted. And Nansen, as I said, had food. Why would Nansen have his hands on food when most of the other prisoners were starving? Because he was Scandinavian. The Nazis, in this kind of crazy worldview that they had, they pegged everybody according to their racial characteristics. And of course, the Nazis believed that as Aryans, they were the master race. They were racially more superior to every other race. We would call them nationalities. Of course, at the very bottom of the totem pole, the Nazis put the Jews. They considered to be racially Untermenschen. They weren't even human. They were subhuman, fit for nothing other than extermination. But the Nazis looked at the Scandinavian prisoners, both the Norwegians and the Danish prisoners. And they said, in many ways, you are racially akin to us. You're almost like our first cousins, racially speaking. I mean, after all, you're tall, you're blonde haired, you're blue eyed. So we will give you one benefit in these camps that we don't extend to any of the other prisoners. And that is they allowed the Norwegians and the Danish, the Scandinavian prisoners, to receive food parcels from the Red Cross. As I say, if you had food, you could bribe anybody for anything. One of the first questions that's often asked of me, and I'll answer it now for you, is how could Nansen write a diary? How could he get his hands on paper and pencil inside of a concentration camp? So my response is, when you had food, you could get anything you wanted. The corruption was unimaginable in these camps. Everything had a price, and it was all denominated in food. So from that day forward, Nansen used his food and tobacco rations that he was getting from the Red Cross to bribe the orderlies to look out for young Tommy, to protect this boy who otherwise had no protectors. And that is how Tommy ultimately survived the war. And to kind of fast forward through his career, he was reunited with his mother, who survived the war afterwards. They didn't immediately up with each other until December 1946. They were looking for almost a year and a half for each other. Tommy ultimately emigrated to the United States when he was a teenager. Now, up until the time he was liberated, when he was 10 years old, he was going on 11 at the time. His birthday is in early May. Tommy was illiterate. But somehow, Tommy was able to kind of catch up on his schooling quite quickly. He arrives as a teenager, as I say, in New Jersey, Paterson, New Jersey. He goes to finishes high school there, goes to a small liberal arts college in West Virginia, and he graduates as the valedictorian of his class. And clearly, this kid had some talent. He then goes to NYU Law School, gets a legal degree. He then goes to Harvard Law School. He gets a master's degree and a doctorate in the field of international human rights, inspired, as he says, by the example of Odd Nansen. And Tom goes on to have one of the most spectacular careers you could imagine. He ends up at the age of roughly 72 years old on the International Court of Justice at The Hague. And that picture on the right is a picture of the adult Tom Bergenthal when he was on the International Court of Justice. And around the time that Tom was about 75 years old, I think he was beginning to think about his own mortality, he finally decided to write his own memoir of how he survived the Holocaust. He had told his children parts of his story, but he had never told his children and grandchildren, anybody else, the kind of full sequence of his life. So, Andrew, if you go to the next slide. So in the year 2010, Tom Bergenthal writes and publishes his memoir called The Lucky Child. That's the picture of the book on the left that you're seeing there. It was, as I say, published in the year 2010. And as you've already heard, I am quite a consumer of books. I think I've always been a frustrated historian, even though I practiced law for 35 years. And I'm always on the lookout for interesting books to read, primarily memoirs, biographies. I like to read about real people and the kind of lives they led. And so in 2010, I go into a bookstore in Charlotte, North Carolina, which is where I was living and practicing law at the time. And I see this newly published book called The Lucky Child. And the subtitle, A Memoir of Surviving Auschwitz as a Young Boy, that's what kind of caught my eye. And so really, on nothing more than an impulse, I bought this memoir. And halfway through it, Tom Bergenthal explains the story that I've just kind of related to you, how he ends up in Sachsenhausen after taking part in what became known in history as the Auschwitz Death March, and how he meets this Norwegian named Odd Nansen. And he says, it's really because of Nansen that I'm alive today. He was the one who saved my life. And then in his memoir, he says, by the way, Odd Nansen kept a diary while he was a prisoner. And that image you can see on the right is a footnote on page 177 of his memoir that gives the details of this diary that he's mentioned in the text above. So when I read Tom's memoir and I saw this footnote, I thought to myself, well, gosh, this memoir has been absolutely fascinating. Maybe this diary that he's referring to in this footnote, maybe that would make rather interesting reading as well. You have to realize when you own 5,000 books, the impetus to buy another book is the easiest thing in the world. I mean, I don't really need much prompting to check out new books. I had never heard of this book, this diary, even though I've read a lot about World War II. And quite frankly, I certainly never heard of the author, Nansen. As I say, frankly, I didn't know a whole lot about Norway's experience in World War II at the time. But I thought, let me find this book. And of course, it's been out of print now since 1949, which means where am I going to go to look for it? Of course, I'm going to have to go on the internet. Everything in the world that somebody is selling somewhere, it's got to be listed on the internet. So I do my search, and I'm able to find one copy of this diary for sale in the entire United States. I saw that one person signed on a few minutes ago from the state of Washington, and that's where the bookstore was located. I could find 2 more copies of Nansen's diary for sale from booksellers in Great Britain, another one from a bookseller in Australia, another one from a bookseller in New Zealand. 5 in the entire world that I could find anywhere on the internet. Where all the other copies had disappeared to, not quite sure. So I bought one of those. I bought it from the bookseller in New Zealand because it was the book that seemed to be in the best condition. When it arrived, again, all I knew about this diary was what I had read in this 5 or 6 line footnote in Tom Bergenthal's memoir. So I opened it up and I thought, a diary is kind of an unusual document. It's not like a novel. It's not a history because there's no themes. There's no foreshadowing. There's no characterization. It's really just a record of what happens on a daily basis. So I wasn't quite sure whether this diary would be even worth my while. Well, within an extremely short period of time, about a week, maybe 10 days, maybe as much as 2 weeks, I was completely smitten by this book. I could not put it down. And I don't know how many of you out there have had a chance to read through the entire diary. But to me, it is one of the most fascinating, inspiring, eloquent books that I had ever read. And what kept occurring to me or going through my mind is, how can it be that this book, which I think is nothing short of a masterpiece, how can it be that no one else has reprinted this book since 1949? I mean, at this point in the year 2010, 61 years have gone by. That's practically a lifetime. And so one day the light bulb went off over my head and I decided, you know what? I'm going to get this book back into print. I don't know exactly how one does this, but I'm going to make it happen. It's just, this book is just too good to be forgotten the way it's been forgotten. And if there's only 5 copies for sale in the entire world on the internet, virtually nobody can buy it as it exists now anyways. So that set me off on this odyssey. I really thought this would take me a year, maybe 18 months to get this book into print. Well, it ended up taking me 6 years. Now, part of that was because, as I fully admit, I was not an expert on getting books published on my own. But I also got so ramped up in researching Odd Nansen and learning about this man, becoming so fascinated, that I decided that rather than simply taking this old version and just typing it up, having somebody else type it in a new digital version so I could get a new publisher, I decided that I would edit the diary, and I would, more importantly, annotate the diary. I would try to explain to people, first of all, who are not experts in World War II, people who are not experts in the Holocaust, people who are not experts in Norway's experience in World War II, what Nansen is talking about, who these people are that he's talking about, where these places are that he has moved from point to point during his incarceration, the events that he's talking about. He hears rumors about the Battle of Stalingrad or Operation Torch or the massacre at the Katyn Forest. Well, if you don't know all about these things, I provide an explanation for this. And in 2016, after, in fact, making a presentation in Nashville, Tennessee, to the Sons of Norway chapter there, a gentleman walked up to me afterwards, and he introduced himself to me. His name is Sten Vermund, and Sten was a professor at Vanderbilt. He said, "Tim, I'd love to help you try to find a publisher. My uncle and my grandfather were both prisoners in the same concentration camp in Norway, a camp called Grini, that Nansen was in. And so I'd love to help you. And so plus I have a good friend who is the director of the Vanderbilt University Press." So as I say, that is, that's how it all turned out. The rest is history. So what I'd like to do now is talk a little bit more about the man himself. So Andrew, if you pull up the next slide, who is this Odd Nansen? Well, this picture is a photograph of the Nansen family. It's taken in the spring of 1902. Since Odd Nansen was born in December 1901, you can kind of easily figure out that he's the young baby in his mother's arms. He is the fourth child born to his mother. Her name was Eva. Sars was her maiden name, Nansen, and his father, Fridtjof Nansen. Now, both of his parents, as probably most of you know, were very famous or very accomplished. They came from very prominent families in Norway at the time. Unfortunately for Odd Nansen, his mother died when he was only 6 years old. She died in 1907 of pneumonia. So Nansen was raised pretty much single-handedly by his father, Fridtjof Nansen. And again, I'm assuming that most of you know what a famous man Fridtjof Nansen was. Growing up in a household with a man like Fridtjof must have been, I think, both a blessing and a curse because of how famous he was. He was a polar explorer. He was the first man to cross Greenland from coast to coast. He was a man who was only 31 years old, formed and led an expedition to get to the North Pole. He didn't make it all the way, but he broke the previous record by something like 200 miles. He got within 150 miles of the North Pole before he had to turn around. He brought everyone back home safely and alive, which was not how most of these polar expeditions ended up. So that kind of made him a world-famous figure. Nansen, then in his 40s, became something of a statesman. He helped Norway achieve its independence in 1905. When Norway became independent, it wanted to have a form of constitutional monarchy, so it needed a new monarch to become the king. The powers that be in Norway identified Prince Karl in Denmark and thought he would be a suitable king for Norway. And so these powers that be, they sent Odd Nansen, the most famous man in the country, to Denmark to convince this man to become the king. And he agreed, and he became King Haakon VII of Norway. And it's now his grandson who is the king in Norway. Then in his 50s, Fridtjof Nansen became a humanitarian. After World War I, he is appointed the first High Commissioner of Refugees for the League of Nations. And he does such a good job for the League of Nations that he is awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1922. So this man has done in one lifetime more than 3 individuals could have done in their entire lifetimes. So as I say, growing up in that kind of household is both a blessing and a curse. But of course, Nansen has to live under that. Nansen himself is very artistic, as both of his parents were artistic. And there are many illustrations in the diary for those of you who've read it. He uses his artistic ability, or he follows his artistic calling, to become an architect. He goes to college in Norway, becomes an architect. Actually, for 3 years, from 1927 to 1930, he lived in the United States. He lived in just in Brooklyn, New York, and worked in Manhattan as an architect. But he returned to Norway in 1930, at which point he probably thought life was going to be, terrific, great opportunities for him going forward. He's living back in the country of his origin with his classmates, the people he went to school with. Everything looks great. But of course, we know that already the storm clouds are beginning to form over Europe. 1933, Hitler becomes the Chancellor of Germany, immediately starts persecuting the Jews, including, as I already mentioned, Tom Bergenthal's parents, who flee from Germany into Czechoslovakia. And so Nansen gets caught up in first humanitarian work in 1936. At the urging of a number of people, he forms an organization called Nansen Help, which means Nansen Relief, and he tries to help these refugees in Europe get visas to come to Norway. It was a very difficult job. It was really an uphill battle for him to try to get these visas. Most of the Western countries, the United States, Great Britain, France, and Norway, were very loath to change their immigration laws to allow Jewish refugees to come into their country. But Nansen was successful by the time the war does break out in 1939 in bringing a little bit under 200 men, women, and children into Norway. So April 9th occurs, April 9th, 1940, surprise invasion by the German forces. Norway holds out for a while, holds out, in fact, longer than most of the other Western countries, France included, before it finally capitulates to the Germans. Nansen joins an underground organization. He's not one of these young people who is going out trying to blow up railroad bridges. He's more kind of getting high-level intelligence and passing it on to the Norwegian government in exile. But there's finally, come fast forward to December of 1941, the British launch a number of commando raids against the coastline of Norway. And the point is to blow up fish oil processing plants that are located along the coastline, which have been repurposed by the Germans to help make explosives. And the head of the German occupying forces, a man named Joseph Terboven, in retaliation for these attacks against the Norwegian coast in late December 1941, he decides what he's going to do is he's going to round up 20 of the most prominent people in Norway and hold them as hostages. He's not going to accuse them of any crime. He's not going to sentence them to a term in prison. He's really going to hold them like an insurance policy or a bargaining chip. And of course, Odd Nansen, being the son of one of the most famous, if not the most famous person the country has ever produced, he is picked up and arrested on January 13th, 1942, as a hostage, not as a resistance fighter, political prisoner, etc. He's initially kept in a prison. It was called a police detention camp located just outside of Oslo, called Gnini. He is then sent in the fall of 1942 to a work camp above the Arctic Circle for a while. He's then returned. It was called Vidal. He's then returned after working. It got so dark and so cold at this camp way above the Arctic Circle that he and all of his other prisoners were returned to Gnini. And then in the summer of 1943, Nansen, actually, he's involved in a practical joke, if you can believe it, with some of his fellow prisoners, that somehow the German, it would take too long to explain it, but the Germans get wind of this and they take it literally. And so they're mortified after they find out that this is just a practical joke. So Nansen is summoned by the commandant of Gnini, and he is told by the commandant, now I'm going to send you to a real concentration camp, a camp in Germany. And you might as well tell your family to put up a headstone for you now, because you're not coming back from this experience. And that is how Nansen ends up in Sachsenhausen in October of 1943. Now, Nansen, as we know, kept a diary. Why did he keep a diary? Well, he writes in his own foreword that he never wrote this with the intention that he was going to publish it. That was the farthest thing from his mind. Nansen had been keeping a journal ever since he was a teenager, since he was in high school. In fact, I've been to Norway on multiple research visits, and the Nansen family has shared with me his journals. It's from his teenage years. It's interesting because all of the margins are all filled with doodles. He loved to draw, animals and funny faces and things like that. So it was kind of natural for him to keep writing a diary. But he says in his foreword, he says, I wrote it really for two reasons and for two people. He said, first of all, I wrote the diary for myself. I wrote it to kind of process what I was going through. He says, writing in my diary was like confiding in a close friend in relieving my mind of all that weighed on it. It became a private manner of forgetting. So just like when you write a grocery list, once you've written it down, you don't have to keep thinking in your mind all the items you're going to have to buy when you get to the grocery store. So I think he could process this and not have to keep revisiting what he was experiencing. He said the second reason why he wrote it was for his wife. He wanted his wife, Kari, to know what he was really going through. Now, he could send her letters through the kind of official mail system that went, right through the concentration camp, but anything that he wrote was censored. Somebody would read everything that he wrote to make sure he wasn't passing on critical information or inside information or anything else. So that really wasn't a helpful way of letting his wife know what was going on. While he was in Gnini, just outside of Oslo, occasionally his wife, Kari, could also get permission to come visit him. But again, when she came to visit him, they were separated by a physical barrier, and there was always a guard in the room. In fact, the guard would be standing right next to the Nansen who could speak Norwegian. So under those circumstances, what can you really tell your spouse? So the diary became his way of really explaining to her what was going on, what was his deepest thoughts, his experiences, his reaction to what was going on. So that was the impetus for him to keep writing. And he writes in the diary, he says, I know I'm taking an enormous risk. At one point, he talks while he's in Sachsenhausen about a Dutch prisoner who was caught red-handed with a diary and is hauled away, and no one ever sees him alive again. And occasionally he would stop writing, but then the diary, 9, 10, 11 days later, the diary picks up again. He says, I just can't keep away from this. I've just got to start processing this information. Now, when he gets to Sachsenhausen in the fall of 1943, he's now got a real dilemma. How do I, preserve this diary in a country that no one is going to help me if they find out what I'm doing? While he was in Gnini, it was actually quite easy for him to get the diary out to his wife. First of all, he would write the diary late at night when most everybody else was asleep. He was one of these people who, much like his father Fritjof, could operate on almost no sleep. He could go to bed at 2:30 in the morning and get up at 4:30 in the morning and go back to work. So he would use those late night hours to write the diary. He said, I would hide it in the one place I knew the Germans would never go looking for it. And that was in the latrine. As long as the pages were hid away in the latrine, he knew they were safe because the Nazis were germaphobes. They considered the latrine to be just a source of infectious diseases. And while he was in Gnini, he says, I could smuggle the pages of the diary out pretty easily because the only people coming into the camp were Norwegian civilians delivering supplies, building supplies, fresh food. Of course, you didn't have refrigeration in those days like you have today. And these Norwegian civilians who were coming in and out of the camp, they were the cousins, the neighbors, the friends, the in-laws of the very prisoners who were inside the camp. So all sorts of ingenious methods were made to allow these prisoners to smuggle. Everybody was smuggling something out to their significant others or their wives. But as I say, once Nansen is in Germany, he says, I can't smuggle this out. No one's on the outside is going to help me. But psychologically, it's become so important for me to keep writing this for my own mental well-being. I have to keep writing it, hoping that I can figure out some way. And if I can't think of any brainstorm on how to get this diary out of this camp, assuming I get out of this camp, assuming the war ever ends while I'm still alive, I will bury the diary in the ground rather than destroy all I've worked on. And parts of diaries have been found buried in the ground at other concentration camps, primarily in Auschwitz. So other prisoners had the same thought that Nansen had. But then Nansen says, I finally had a brainstorm. And I realized that even though I and all the other fellow prisoners in Sachsenhausen, we were all searched when we left the camp to go to work. There were so many people. Sachsenhausen, by the spring of 1945, had a prisoner population of about 35 to 40,000 prisoners. So there was no room for them to do any work inside the camp. So they all had to leave. They were searched when they left. They were searched when they came back. And he realized over time that what the guards were worried about were weapons. They were worried about prisoners getting their hands on weapons and then staging an uprising. There was a prisoner uprising in Treblinka. There was a prisoner uprising in Auschwitz at one point. There was a prisoner uprising in Sobibor. So this was not an idle threat. And Nansen says, realize that on the weapons, the guards really aren't worried about the things that we prisoners carried with us just to kind of get through life. One thing we all kept on us at all times was a tin cup. We would tie it around our waists so we could drink something, right? It was of your barracks would put a loaf of bread on your breadboard, and that's what you would eat off of. So Nansen realized, and you can see this image here, that he could have his breadboard split open by a friend of his who worked in the carpentry shop, and he would put the pages of the diary inside that breadboard, glue it together, and no one would be any wiser. And so at the end of the war, he and 5 of his closest friends walked out of the camps with their breadboards. Nobody even looked at them, gave him a second look. And that's how he smuggled the entire German portion of the diary out. Now, looking at this image, this is actually a real breadboard. This is not Nansens. Nansens is on display, on permanent display in Norway's Resistance Museum in the Akershus Castle in Oslo. This is one of his friends that they allowed me to take a picture of. And you can see from the image on the right that the paper he was writing on was tissue paper, ultra thin tissue paper. So he could pack a lot of pages into what was really a very, very small cavity. The other thing that's even harder to tell from this is that this handwriting is microscopically small, such that when the typists took these pages to transcribe it for publication in Norway in 1947, they needed magnifying glasses just to read Nansen's handwriting. So that is how Nansen was able to preserve this diary and then collect it all at the end of the war and publish it in 1947, as I said. It was a #1 bestseller in Norway in 1947, came out in 3 volumes in the Norwegian version. And I think because of its great sales performance in Norway, it caught the eye of publishers in the United States, Great Britain, and in Germany. So it was translated into English and German in 1949. And that was the kind of the genesis of its appearance in America. It got great reviews in 1949. A man who wrote The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, he would write that and publish that in 1960. That's still the best-selling book ever written about World War II. He wrote a review saying, this is, one of the most magnificent books to come out of World War II. But despite this great reviews that occurred in 1949, the book did not sell very well. And I don't know for a fact the reason, but I surmise that by 1949, people had gotten tired of reading about World War II. The world had kind of moved on. By 1948, 49, the Berlin airlift is underway. Now we are helping the Germans. We're not fighting the Germans anymore. It's the Russians who are our enemies under the Cold War. So I think reading a book about the terrible things done by the Germans to these prisoners in these concentration camps had really kind of lost any interest it had. And if you look at all the bestseller lists, 1946, the #1 bestseller is Churchill's Memoirs. It's an 8-volume memoir. 1947 in America, it's Eisenhower's memoir, a book called Crusade in Europe. After 1948, 1949, there's not a single military book that makes the New York Times bestseller list. It's people are reading fiction, they're reading humor, they're just kind of putting all that behind them. And for whatever reason, as I say, it kind of fell into a black hole for the next 61 years. So that's kind of a shortened overview of a little bit about how I stumbled upon this diary in the first place, and who the man was who wrote it, and why he wrote it, and how he preserved it. And so now I hope that between your experience with the book and your curiosity, and maybe some of the things I've talked about in this presentation, that you'll have some questions, and perhaps Maren will have some questions as well. This is the part I love to hear, what it is that interests people about this. So I will stop talking for a while and open it up to questions.
No, not at all. It's just absolutely fascinating hearing you share the story of this. Thank you so much. Dr. Johnson's internet had a little glitch, and so somehow the way that she rejoined our meeting, she's currently an attendee, and we're sorting that out so that we can get her transferred back to being a panelist. But in the meantime, I have some of the questions that she had sent to ask about. And one of them that she was really interested in hearing you talk about is, what does Nansen's story tell us about Norwegian culture and values, or the norms at the time, and how that has grown and changed through the decades since this diary was first published?
Ooh, okay, that's a big question. I could just talk about that for the rest of the evening. But, well, what I would say, and as I confessed before, I should begin with one confession, which is I am not Norwegian. My grandparents were all Irish immigrants to America at the turn of the 20th century. And as I admitted when I was talking before about the book, I couldn't have told you almost anything about Norway's experience during World War II until I stumbled upon this. And of course, now I know quite a bit. I've become so fascinated with it. And to me, Nansen is clearly a hero. He is a man who somehow, as I say, a man who kept his humanity in the most inhumane conditions mankind has ever conceived of. But if you read his diary, and you read a lot of the other literature about World War II, what astounds me is how many other people were heroes. And they're much more unsung. And the people who were involved in the Wehrmacht raid to destroy the heavy water plant, there were a number of people involved. And of course, we all know about some of the major names, but how these young people put themselves at risk, their families at risk. Their families knew what they were involved in, and if they ever were caught, that probably the entire family would be punished. And yet they did what they thought was right. And to me, it's just absolutely inspiring. Now, of course, I know there were plenty of people who joined the NS party, the National Samling Party, Quisling's party, for whatever reason, for advancement, for a good job. But to me, the number of people who did not, who resisted along the way, who helped the resistance fighters, is the inspiring story. I think it's just astounding to me that of what Norway did, and I don't think they get enough credit and enough billing. In World War II, everybody is reading about D-Day and the bombing campaigns, and Norway is kind of this little peripheral situation where they're occupied till 1945, and the occupation ends, and they go back to normal, and life is good. So it's to me, it's a shame, and hopefully people who read this diary get a much better glimpse of what the Norwegians did and what they suffered through. I mean, the scorched earth policy as the Germans were retreating through the north at the very end of the war is astounding. People had to live in holes in the ground, in caves, because everything had been destroyed when the Germans retreated. So to me, it's awakening and just absolutely inspiring, which is why I love to go to Norway as much as I can now to continue doing research. And I've become very close friends with the Nansen family as a result of my research. And they are absolutely the most inspiring people in the world. I was very, very close. I had a very close friendship with Nansen's eldest daughter, Marit. I met her for the first time in 2011. And I could not have done what I accomplished with this diary without her help, because she knew so much. and she was so willing to work. And yet, if you ever met her, you would never believe that her grandfather was the winner of the Nobel Peace Prize, or that her father wrote one of the most incredible, fantastic diaries to survive World War II in a concentration camp. There's only about, based on my research, no more than maybe between 2 and 3 dozen diaries that we know that exist that were written inside of the concentration camp, not a memoir that somebody wrote 10 or 15 or 20 or 30 years after the war when their memory gets a little bit hazy. This is a firsthand account. And of those, there's only 5 that I can find that have ever been translated into English. So this really is a unique document. And I think it needs to be much more widely known than it is. And that's kind of my goal in making these kind of presentations.
Wonderful. Well, I'm going to say welcome back, Dr. Johnson. It is good to have you back on camera with us.
If you see sweat beads on my neck, that's all I've been trying. So I apologize about that. Hopefully we're back in and going here. Tim, I heard all of it. I was plugged in different ways, but it's riveting. We've got a couple questions coming in through the chat right now. And so we've got one comment coming in that's saying, it finds it so amazing, Nansen's ability to even empathize with some of the Gestapo or SS members and the German guards, and where that comes from, and how is he able to, I don't know, as you were writing about, as you're working with his material, are there some seeds to that empathy, or, is that kind of part of the humanistic Nansen way that comes through the family? And you've got kind of a multi-generational perspective there on that.
Right. Well, I think that that is truly one of the most outstanding things. And for those of you who have read the diary, when Nansen is in Grini at one point, he is talking to this guard, and this guard kind of breaks down in tears and kind of confesses that he feels bad about what's happening. And Nansen, and I'm going to paraphrase, I can't remember exactly what it is, but he almost says something like, it would be easier if I could hate them all. If I could just lump Germans are evil, and I'm just going to hate every one of them. But he saw them as individuals. And because of that, he was able to empathize even with people who are his persecutors, which I think is truly astounding. And I think it is a legacy of his father, Fridtjof Nansen. I don't know other people. I'm sure there are other people who felt that way. But I think in Nansen's case, were it not for Fridtjof and the work that he did, where, Fridtjof Nansen, one of the other things that he did is he went to the Ukraine in 1920 to help with a famine. Many people said, "What are you doing? You're helping Bolsheviks, the hated red menace of communism. You're helping these people stay alive. You shouldn't be there." But he said, "They're people. They're human beings. You can't just leave them behind." And in Nansen's postscript, he kind of says the same thing, that you've got to break down these barriers and not look at people on a tribal basis. And as I think I may have mentioned to you before, Andrew and Maren, I found out, it's actually in Tom's memoir, that he mentions that when Nansen's diary was translated into German in 1949, that Nansen gave away all the royalties for the German translation of his diary to German refugees after the war. He said, if we do not rehabilitate Germany and help these people to get back on their feet, get them jobs and meaningful lives, we will just create another cycle of hate, which will result in another war in another generation. And Tom writes in his memoir, he says, really, that opened my own eyes to this. If a man like Nansen can do that, Tom said, I had all of this hate built up. I wanted to kill every German I could get my hands on. They had killed my father. They had separated me from my mother for years. If he could do this, what could I do? And I'll tell you an interesting anecdote. When I had read Tom's memoir, and then I read Nansen's diary, I found Tom Bergenthal's email. He was still at The Hague at that point. I sent him an email telling him how moved I was by both these books. And he wrote back saying, well, I am about to retire from the bench, from the International Court of Justice, and I'll be moving back to Washington, D.C., and I'll be teaching at GW Law School. So I, at that point, arranged to make myself get to Washington, D.C. to meet this man. I just had to meet him and talk to him about his book and about Nansen, and to tell him, at that point, the idea had germinated enough that I was thinking of republishing the diary, and I wanted to get Tom's thoughts. And at the end of our conversation, I had my old 1949 edition of the diary, and I said, Mr. Bergenthal, would you mind signing this for me? Now, I know you're not the author of this book, but it is dedicated to you by Nansen in the dedication page, and you are one of the major characters in this diary. So would you sign it? And Tom said, yeah, of course I'll do that. What would you like me to say? And I was kind of tongue-tied. It was like, I don't know what, you can write anything you want. To me, it'll be amazing if you just say best wishes, Tom Bergenthal. And he spent like almost a good 60 seconds staring at the ceiling, kind of collecting his thoughts. And then he took out his pen and he wrote a fairly long inscription. And then he closed the book and he kind of shoved it across the desk to me, where I was sitting on the other side of the desk. And I didn't have the guts to just open it up in front of him and see what he had said. So I waited until our meeting was over. And as soon as I got out of his office and the door shut, I opened his book. And Tom wrote this. He said, remembering Odd Nansen, the man who not only saved my life, but more importantly, taught me to forgive. And to me, that's the message of Odd Nansen and Tom, and the message of Tom Bergenthal. So
that's wonderful.
Yeah.
Unbelievable. What unbelievable. I mean, the human spirit, the power of the human spirit.
Yes. And his children, his grandchildren are much the same way. I'll tell you that.
So you've been able to interact with the family. And what was the reception when you presented the idea of republishing these in English? And how, you worked with Marit on this, but how did they perceive that initially in the initial conversation?
Well, the way it turned out was at this first meeting with Tom Bergenthal, he first of all, he said to me, when he had heard what I wanted to do, and he was totally in favor of it, thought it was magnificent that somebody could get Nansen's words back into print. And he said, I have been friends with the Nansen family since I was a child. And I can tell you how they met up, but Tom had been friends for now 60 years with Nansen's children. Marit, the oldest, Igor, the second oldest, a boy, Sidi, the third, and there was a young boy, Odd Nansen, who was actually born while Nansen was in prison. And he was friends with all of them. And he said, I will be happy to write to Marit because she's really the family historian. She knows everything. And recommend, introduce basically a letter of recommendation for you, so that when you contact her, and I'll give you her contact information, she'll know who you are and she won't just kind of blow this off. And so he made the introduction, and we exchanged very formal letters initially. Here's what my plan is, and I'd like to enlist your help. And within less than a year, less than 12 months later, I happened to be invited to a wedding in Stockholm. And so I made my trip and fly on the return flight, fly through Oslo. And I met up with both Marit and Igor. He was still alive at that point. They've both since passed away. And they couldn't have been more charming and more welcoming. They invited me into their house and immediately started answering questions. And through the benefit of email, we started a correspondence. And I would pepper her with more questions than you can imagine. And she knew she knew the answer to every single one of them. I mean, she was really just absolutely phenomenal. As I say, but for her, this diary would not be, at least my additions to it, my footnotes, my introduction would be the poorer, but for all of the information that Marit gave me. When Nansen was arrested, he and his family were on holiday. It was January, and they were in a hutta in East Gausdal, way kind of a good several hours drive north of Oslo. At that point, school had been closed because the Nazis were trying to save fuel during the wintertime. So they were all up in this hutta, and they were listening to the BBC at night. Now, owning a radio was already prohibited. You were supposed to have turned in your radio by that time. And listening to the BBC was punishable by death. But they were doing this, and the Gestapo showed up and knocked on the door and said that when Nansen opened the door, fearing that they were going to arrest him for owning a radio, they simply said, "You're wanted for questioning in Oslo. You're not arrested, but you have to come with us right now." And Marit was able to describe what the living room looked like when they were all sitting around while this happened. I mean, that's how sharp her memory still was, undimmed for all these years. So just a terrific resource. And I became, not only was she a great source, but we became actually very close friends. And Marit traveled to the United States and was my house guest on 2 different occasions, both in 2012 and in 2016. And couldn't have been a more delightful guest. And of course, I've been to Norway multiple times, and I've been told that I'm an official member of the Nansen family at this point. So it's I could never have imagined when I made this decision back in 2010 that I'd become such close friends with both the Nansen family, also with Tom Bergenthal. Tom is still alive. He's 87 years old. And recently he asked me if I would consider writing his biography of his life. So that's, to be continued. But those friendships have enriched my life immensely.
Beautiful. We have a question from Celia, who is, what more do you know about Kari and the family experience at home? This kind of dovetails off of what we were just talking about, and details that Odd perhaps didn't even know at the time.
True. Yes. Okay. Well, that is a very good question. During the initial invasion, the family was very fearful that, well, I should back up. You saw that one picture of the family mansion, Polhoida, which is a very, very large structure in the outskirts of Oslo. It's just to the west. It's a community known as Lysaker. And it's built on a bluff. It has got a commanding view of the Oslo fjord. That's the back steps of it. On the other side, the lawn kind of slopes down, and then you have this magnificent view of the Oslo fjord. And when Fridtjof Nansen died, Odd Nansen moved into the house and occupied it with his family. And when the Germans invaded, they were fearful that they would be evicted from this. The Germans were kind of willy-nilly seizing whatever they wanted. And in fact, they showed up and said, "You have to move out. We're going to turn this building into a hospital." Fortunately, the German general who was in charge of that area, I guess, of Norway, got wind of this. And he said, no, this is the house of the famous explorer Fridtjof Nansen. No Germans are allowed in this house. So they were very, very fortunate that they were allowed to live undisturbed in the house. But that didn't mean that they didn't have their share of struggles. Marit tells me how they made salad out of dandelions, just trying to get any food. They raised rabbits for their meat. At one point, they raised 2 pigs. They had 2 pigs, which they raised so they could slaughter them. And they were named Adolf and Hermann, as in Hermann Goering. And at one point, they also raised chickens. And Mara tells a funny story. I think I, in fact, put it in a footnote in the diary, where she says they had one rabbit, and somehow this rabbit began to act like a chicken. He would stay with the chickens, sit on the sill with the chickens. She said the only surprising thing is he never produced an egg. So.
Oh my goodness! Wow.
But so they had their struggles, but they did manage to survive and make do. Interestingly, Marit first heard that Nansen was liberated by a radio broadcast, not from Nansen. She hadn't gotten any word from him up to that point. He was then in southern Sweden. He was first transferred from Germany to Denmark as part of the White Buses operation, which many of you might know of, and then finally they were all transferred over to Sweden. but she only knew that he had been liberated through a radio broadcast. So that was rather unusual. And as I mentioned in the diary, even when Nansen was in Sachsenhausen, they could write letters, but Nansen was limited to, I think, only 2 letters per month. And if the censor opened the letter and thought that there was something in the contents of the letter that was objectionable, he would throw the letter out and deliver the empty envelope, and that counted against your quota of 2 letters per month. And so Nansen says, I would get these letters, unsolicited letters from strangers who were writing to me, who knew who I was. And if they said something, totally anti-German in the letter, the Germans in Sachsenhausen would throw away the letter, rip it up, and give him the envelope and say, okay, that's one of your quota of 2. And he says, I can't even write a letter to this person saying, don't write to me like this, because my letter would have this same objectionable language, and the censor will throw that out. And it was almost like a catch-22. So the fact that he got any letters at all from Kari during his incarceration in Sachsenhausen was something really short of a miracle.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
Unbelievable. I'm struck in the text, power of his ability. We talked a little bit about this, the power of his ability to build relationship with those around him. As we've talked about, seeing humanity. Chris is asking a question. What do you think precipitated the way Nansen's relationship with Denzer degraded? And she writes, it seems like Denzer became mentally ill or unstable in a way. What's your perspective of that?
Well, that's a good question. Of course, the whole first half of the diary is this kind of contact with Denzer going back and forth. And I think, as I read it, I think the one thing that Denzer wanted from Nansen was submission. He wanted Nansen to acknowledge that he was in control of Nansen's fate and almost kind of plead for mercy. And Nansen was not prepared to do that. That's my read of this, that no matter how bad things got, he was not going to beg for special treatment. And he was not going to acknowledge that Denzer was his superior in any way. I mean, he was a prisoner, but he didn't have to act like a prisoner. He could maintain his own dignity. And I think that's what kind of drove Denzer crazy, that he refused this. What I find particularly interesting, and this actually is not involving Denzer, but there was one time when Nansen is interviewed by the head of the Gestapo, and I'm drawing a blank on his name. I think it was Fellis, Fehlis, and he doesn't even know why he's being summoned for this interrogation. And he goes into this, and it's almost like they want him to confess that yes, he has written anti-German propaganda, and yes, he is favorable to the communists. And Nansen says, no, I know, I'm not following any particular political party here. I'm just a humanist. But Nansen goes on to say, he says, they're almost looking for me to confess for something. And he says, they asked their questions in such a cunning fashion that even silence was a form of treason. And on no account would I agree or to even, acknowledge something by not saying, by keeping silent. I had to say what I really thought. And if that has destroyed my chances of ever getting an early release, well, then so be it. And to me, when I read that passage, I almost feel like he's channeling Fridtjof Nansen. Fridtjof Nansen was one of these men who struck out on his own, didn't care what other people thought. They all told him his expeditions were going to end in disaster, that they were crazy, what he was trying to do. And he quotes, who does he quote? Some other famous Norwegian who skipped my mind, that his favorite quote was, he is strongest who stands most alone, and that's the way Nansen was. He wasn't going to trim his sails. He wasn't going to kind of back off of his views. And I think that's what ultimately drove Denzer to this furious, situation where he ends up getting him kicked out of Gdynia. So that's a great question. Now, thank you. Obviously, whoever asked that has read has read the book.
Yeah. Oh, it's great. That's a Henrik Ibsen quote from the end of
Yes.
his really famous play, An Enemy of the People, which is an interesting, given this, right, is a really interesting, this topic is a really interesting quote that he favors.
Yes.
For sure.
Quite.
And fascinating, and I find it fascinating in the forward to the discussion about Odd's struggle with his relationship with his father as well. That there are strong Nansen genes that are passed down there, but at the same time, there was a lot of strife between the two of them, it seems.
Yes. There's no question about that. But Nansen, unlike his brother, had a strong enough personality that he could stand up to his father, whereas his brother Kåre just had to escape to Canada, never to return. It's astounding to me that a father, you can't imagine a father saying, my son's personality is weak. He's a weak person. I mean, he was not into self approval and just making people feel good for the sake of feeling good. He thought, if you want to be tough, I mean, if you read Farthest North and you think about the incredible, not only the physical strain that he went through, but the mental strain of trying to stay alive in this trackless wilderness with just one other human being, Hansen with him, where they're not even sure they're in the right direction. Their watches has stopped, so they're not even sure of their longitude anymore. And yet it's almost like he wills himself to survive until he finally meets up with the British adventurer there.
It's strong people, strong humans, strong with incredible constitution.
Exactly.
And I think, that's one of when I was reading this, it's one of the things that just struck me over and over again was just the incredible strength of character and of personhood.
Yes.
And how that's
whatever the consequences are, he's prepared to live with them. I mean, he's not trying to save himself.
Yeah. No, but it's a very strong commitment to core principles and values.
Yes.
Driving him forward in this. And I think Tim, the book is incredible. And
I'm glad you agree.
I think we all know that we could probably go for another 5-6 hours talking about this. We didn't even get to talk about the writing process, and the editorial process for you about how this kind of conversation, because editing is a very different craft than authoring just as yourself. So perhaps we're going to need to do a part 2 on this.
Okay.
Tonight.
I'm happy to do that.
That would be lovely.
I do tell people it's easy for me to be a spokesman for this book because I didn't write it. So I have no ego. It's not like I'm saying that what I've written is phenomenal. I'm saying what somebody else wrote is phenomenal. And so I can say that without blushing because I truly believe that is the case. And I dare people, and I've been doing this now since 2016. If you read this entire book, which takes a while, it takes a lot of commitment to get through the whole day. If you read this, if you're not moved by this diary, then I really think there's something wrong with you. And I have not met a person yet who has finished this book who has not come back and said, Tim, everything you said about the book is true, if not more so. And so that is my motivating factor. I want people to read the book. As I think I mentioned to you, Maren, in a previous conversation, when I decided to get this book back into print, I had no profit motive whatsoever. I had already known what Nansen had done about giving away the royalties for the German translation. I also knew that Fridtjof Nansen had given away some, I'm not quite sure what the percentage is, of the award that he received, the cash award, when he received the Nobel Peace Prize, to start funding experimental farms in the Ukraine to help with the famine that was still continuing at that point. So I knew in my heart of hearts that if I could get this thing published, I would give away whatever royalties accrued from the sale of this book to a charity that Nansen, were he alive, would have approved of. And it was really in consultation with Maren that we decided that 50% of all the royalties and all my speaking fees would be donated to the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in D.C. and 50% to the Center for the Study of the Holocaust in Oslo. So I can say, without feeling like I'm trying to line my pockets, read the book. That's what I want people to do. Read the book, because it'll change your life. Changed my life. So
it will. And Tim, your work is carrying forward this story for the next generations. Hopefully. And so we talked about last week, we're going to include this in one of our classes at Luther College coming up in the next couple of years. And so tonight we just say thank you. We've got so many more questions to come, but thank you for being here. Thank you to all of you. Thanks for your patience. Andrew, you are a whiz. Tim, thanks for dealing with my little tech glitch tonight. Welcome back for season 2 of Bokprat, and I look forward. I hope everybody will be able to join us in October when we talk about Viking economics. But tonight we just say en kjempestor takk, a huge thank you, Tim, for your incredible storytelling and for lifting this up.
I enjoyed it. If there's anyone out there, all you have to do is remember my name, Tim Boyce, and you can go to my website and sign up for my blogs. I write about subjects dealing with Nansen, the war, the Holocaust, and anything in between that strikes my interest. But I'd love to have you join my conversation, my blogs. I hear from people all around the world now, and I'll kind of leave it at that. But it's been my honor, my pleasure to have a chance to tell a little bit about this incredible man.